So, in the last episode, we did Julius Caesar and his landing, the first date in recorded history, as I think everybody agrees.
The second most important date in history.
So we have moved on almost a century. The context is now totally different. We're into the empire. Claudius is the emperor. People remember Claudius who've seen the TV show I, Claudius, or read Robert Graves' novels. And the context, the political context, is so different because Rome is an autocracy now and not a competitive republic.
Yeah, and I think that the change between the age of Caesar and Claudius, so it's a century pretty much, is best summed up by the way that the Latin word imperator has evolved. So in Caesar's time, imperator means a general, a victorious general. If you win a victory, your soldiers hail you as imperator. By the time of Claudius, it's coming to take on the connotations of the English word emperor, which of course derives from the Latin word imperator. And this reflects the fact that the Roman Empire now has a single figure at its head. This is a reflection of the great revolution that's been achieved by Caesar's adopted son, his great nephew, the man who rules as Augustus Caesar. And the consequence of this is that the Roman Empire is even more formidable than it had been in Caesar's day. So it's hugely expanded. It's about twice the size that it was back in Caesar's time. It has this incredible innovation, which is professional armies, at which the figure of Caesar stands at the head. So there's a very clear chain of command. And it has a very aggressive public ideology, which is essentially that the Romans have the right to conquer anywhere they like. Empire without limits is what Virgil called it. But despite that fact, although under Augustus there had been a lot of conquest, as I said, under his two heirs, so first Tiberius, who had been his adopted son, and then Caligula, who had been his great-grandson. So that's why they come to rule, because they are kind of, both those two emperors have the mystique of Augustus kind of haloing them. Despite that, there hasn't actually been any major campaigns of conquest. And I think there's a sense in the Roman high command, in the capital, that the empire has reached its natural limits,
right,
that it's bounded by deserts, by barbarians it's not worth conquering, or, of course, by the ocean.
So the question then, Tom, so given that in the last episode, we said that apart from slaves and oysters, I think it was, and a few pearls.
And I should have mentioned hunting dogs as well.
And hunting dogs.
And hoodies as well.
Hoodies?
Yeah, Britain's very well known for its hoodies.
As in people are wearing hoodies?
Yeah.
Okay, that's
cloaked.
Right.
Cloaked, hooded cloaks.
So apart from those things, which, to be honest, in the grand scheme of things, if you're ruling the Roman Empire with the enormous wealth of the Mediterranean and of Egypt, what's now Turkey, Asia Minor, and so on, these things are pretty small.
Not worth the effort. Not worth the faff.
Why would anybody launch an invasion of Britain at all?
Well, I think it's because Claudius has come to power very recently, and he is very concerned to establish himself as a genuine imperator in both senses of the word. So as an emperor and as a general. And he wants to establish himself as an emperor because he does not have, he cannot cast himself as a son of Augustus, as Tiberius and Caligula had been able to do. He has come to power in a coup, and although he's been raised in the imperial family, this is because he is Augustus's stepson. So he's the grandson of Augustus's wife and Livia had been married to a Claudius before she married Augustus. And this is why Claudius has been raised in the bosom of Augustus's household. And so he kind of needs to establish his legitimacy, but he needs to establish his legitimacy as a general as well as an emperor, because he hasn't really had any military experience, but also he hasn't had any kind of experience of being in a position of authority at all. His elder brother, a very kind of dashing man who gets the name Germanicus because of his campaigns in Germany, he's the great idol of the Roman people. He dies young, like kind of Princess Diana. It's kind of mass public effusions. So if Claudius had been like Germanicus, there wouldn't really be a problem. But he hadn't been, for reasons that everyone who's seen I, Claudius or read the books by Robert Graves will know, that Claudius is he dribbles, He snorts snot out through his nose. He stammers. He has a limp.
Yeah.
And he's seen by his own mother, as well as by everyone else, as an absolute idiot. So for that reason, he hasn't been given any public responsibilities at all. So he doesn't have a track record that he can use to kind of buttress his authority as an emperor. In fact, I mean, he's not stupid at all. He's very smart. He's very competent. He's quite a scholar. But his style of administration it doesn't seem heroic to most Romans. He's grown up surrounded by women and by freedmen, and as emperor, he relies on them because, of course, freedmen are appointed to run the treasury or whatever because they're very, very competent. But people don't want to believe, freeborn Romans don't want to feel that former slaves have positions of authority over them. So it's absolutely classic of Claudius that he's informed there's a mutiny and he should send a freed person to try and sort it out. And really, I mean, he's kind of lucky the mutiny ends the way that it does. But people may also be wondering, why has there been a mutiny? There hadn't been a mutiny when Caesar led his armies across the ocean, and that was the first Roman invasion of Britain. And I think the reason for that is that in the intervening century between Caesar's invasion and Claudius's invasion, two major disasters have happened that cast very, very long shadows over the imaginations of everyone who is contemplating an invasion of Britain. And the first of these had happened 34 years previously in AD 9. And that's the annihilation of 3 legions beyond the Rhine.
And that's the Varus, the Teutenberg forest, under Augustus.
The Varian disaster. And this had been against the backdrop of an attempt by the Romans to establish a province across the Rhine in Germany. These 3 legions get wiped out, and essentially the Roman occupation force withdraws to behind the Rhine. So that is a huge disaster that everyone is aware of. The other one happens 7 years later in AD 16, and it happens under the aegis of Germanicus, who's been leading reprisal campaigns against the Germans who had destroyed Varus. And he sets sail into the North Sea on a great fleet, and a storm hits this fleet and absolutely destroys it. And Germanicus himself only kind of survives with great difficulty. And actually the disaster is so great that he has to be restrained from committing suicide. And you can see why the thought of crossing the ocean and landing in a place where they might be cut off and is full of completely terrifying barbarians would be a shadow, because there's a sense that the Britons are even more barbarous than the Germans.
Because of their blueness, their moustaches,
yes,
drinking milk,
yes,
and other deviant behaviours, as I believe the jargon now has it.
Women are supposed to strip off and paint themselves black. I mean, all kinds of terrible things.
Right.
I think that anxiety about the dimension of the supernatural that we talked about in the context of Caesar's expedition has grown and grown and grown. And the reason for this is that every Roman soldier knows what had happened to prisoners that were captured by the Germans in AD 9, that they were sacrificed to the German gods, that they were drowned in bogs, that they were taken into woods, that they were hanged from oak trees, that they were beheaded, that they had unspeakable tortures inflicted on them, offered up essentially as sacrifices to the gods. And they also have a sense that the storms that destroyed the Roman fleet, again, this had, it's almost like something from Greek mythology, that sailors who came back, soldiers who were shipwrecked and were returned to Roman territory, reported having seen terrible sea monsters of ambiguous form between man and beast, and strange birds. So I think there's a sense that Britain isn't just barbarous, it's demon haunted. And this reputation that Britain has as being not just a place where magic is very strong, but the home of magic is something that endures even after the invasion has been launched. So Pliny, writing about 30 years later, he writes about Britain that magic to this very day holds it in its shadow.
But Tom, how is this different from 100 years previously? When Caesar had done so. The context for Caesar's invasion was slightly different in that those 2 disasters, the Teutoburg Forest and the disaster of the fleet, that they hadn't happened. So maybe the soldiers are.
So I think that absolutely amplifies.
So these soldiers are a bit more confident. But why are they not similarly anxious about magic? and all that stuff, or are they?
Well, because I think back in Caesar's day, they weren't as sure about Britain's reputation. And that has grown over the succeeding decades, in part actually because of Caesar's campaigns and his commentaries, because Caesar fighting in Gaul had written about a kind of cadre of priests who had practiced human sacrifice, Caesar writes. And these same priests, their home is seen as being Britain. And in Britain, it is said, they practice these unspeakable rites of sacrifice in kind of oaken groves festooned with mistletoe. And these priests are the Druids.
But am I not right in thinking the Druids don't actually exist? Am I giving too much away there?
No, the Druids do exist. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The Romans report on them in such detail that it's impossible to think that they just made them up. It's true that we have no artifacts, no physical evidence actually proving the existence of Druids. But I think one of the things that suggests they did exist is the fact that Roman attitudes to them are actually very ambivalent. So there is a whole tradition in not just Romans, Greeks as well, looking on Druids as kind of philosophers, great natural scientists. So Cicero, who we mentioned in the previous episode, the great orator, he actually meets with a Druid, a man called Diviciacus, in Rome, and is hugely impressed by him. Says, he knows all about astronomy and philosophy. And he can tell the future. He's absolutely brilliant. But other Romans see them as the epitome of everything that is dark and sinister and demonic. They see them as kind of terrifying necromancers. So
are they burning people in wicker men, Tom? Is that correct?
Right. So that is a story that Caesar reports. And Caesar's reports absolutely embody this ambivalence that the Romans feel about Druids. So on the one hand, Diviciacus, the guy who goes to Rome, he's doing this as an ally and a friend of Caesar.
Yeah.
Caesar respects and admires him. On the other hand, Caesar is saying, they get, the Druids round up criminals and put them in these vast kind of wicker men. If they find any policemen, they'll put them in there as well.
Exactly.
All that kind of thing.
Edward Woodward.
Yeah, find him. He's straight in. And I think what happens in the wake of the occupation of Gaul is that attitudes in Rome harden towards the Druids. They come to be seen as subversive, kind of people who they're impressive figures, and they are agitators against Roman rule, and that makes them dangerous. And so Tiberius, who succeeds Augustus as emperor, he orders their suppression. So the idea that Romans tolerate everything, all gods, isn't true. They come to see the Druids as being exceedingly dangerous, and they are wiped out across Gaul. But in Britain, of course, the Druids are still there. The long arm of Roman law doesn't reach across the channel. And so you can see why an anxiety about Britain as a land of sorcery and magic blurs into an anxiety about Britain as a land where you are likely to be captured and tortured to death and have your entrails hung over oaken glades. Yeah. So, it's, I wouldn't want to get on a ship if that was what I was
kind of worrying about. If the Druids are waiting for you, the other end.
Now, you asked, is it true? Were there Druids? So I'll quote you Ronald Hutton, who did the 2 episodes we did on pagan Britain. Very much a friend of the show. So he says, the Druids were the leading experts in religion, magic, and other matters concerning the supernatural among the Iron Age peoples of northwestern Europe who spoke Celtic languages, including the British. And that is all that can be said about them with absolute certainty. So I think Ronald Hutton is incredibly skeptical.
Yeah.
And if he says that they existed, then I think you can accept that they did.
Yeah.
But I think what you can add to that is that the Romans did see them as being politically dangerous. Mm-hmm. And that's why they're targeted for extirpation. And it's clear the Romans did also believe that they were practicing human sacrifice. Now, Hutton, in his book, Pagan Britain, which is brilliant in all this, he's very skeptical about this, the idea that Druids were actually practicing human sacrifice. And he says, well, the Romans said this about the Jews or the Christians, and we don't tend to think that they practice human sacrifice. Exactly, but that's it. That's the counter view, because the Romans said the Carthaginians practiced human sacrifice, and archaeological evidence suggests that they did. And likewise, if we look at 16th century history, the Aztecs did practice sacrifice.
Right.
So it is possible.
So just because people say it doesn't mean that it's not true.
Yeah. But it kind of highlights the difficulty we have in making sense of the Roman conquest of Britain, is that, something so fundamental you have to say is probably not proven. Although, I mean, to give people a spoiler, I think they probably did offer human sacrifice at moments of particular stress and danger.
And on the sacrifice issue, just before we move on to the sort of what else we know about Britain, is it the case that, as with your example about the 16th century, the Spanish and the Mexica, is it the case that the Romans are using the human sacrifice thing as a kind of, that it's a kind of a bit of liberal interventionism from them, and this is one of their pretexts?
Yes.
Yeah.
It is. So they're going over there, they're stopping human sacrifice, taking prisoners and bringing them back to fight as gladiators in the arena.
Well, that's a definite progressive change, isn't it?
It is. It's progressive imperialism at its best. So one of the paradoxes of all this growing sense of Britain as a terrifying place of darkness and magic, is that actually over the centuries, we were talking about at the end of the previous episode, the British tribes in the southeast of Britain, in the lowlands, have actually, they have become increasingly integrated into the networks of Roman rule and of Roman trade. And as we also mentioned, they are no longer entirely prehistoric. And this is the form of these remarkable coins that have the names of British rulers stamped on them. And I know you're not a great man for an ancient coin, Dominic.
No, I love coins, Tom.
Do you?
You're quite mistaken. I love
well, in that
coin.
case, that's okay. So you must have seen these British coins. They're beautiful. They're kind of abstract. They're weird. They have a kind of strange physical quality that you can angle them and you will see new things.
Right.
So it may look purely abstract when you look at it one way, but you angle it another way and suddenly you see a kind of face. And there's a wonderful description of them by Duncan Mackay, who's written a superb book on Boudecia called Echo Lands, which I'll be quoting a lot in our next episode on Boudecia. It came out last year and it's quite the best book on Roman Britain I've read in ages, and I highly recommend it to everyone. And he describes these coins beautifully. He calls them little tabs of hallucinatory braille,
right?
Which I absolutely love. I mean, anyone who's touched one will immediately recognize what he means. And ultimately, these coins derive not from the Romans, but from the Greeks, and specifically from the Macedonians. So they are based on coins issued by Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great.
What a lovely link.
Yeah. And so this particular coin that shows a charioteer on one side, Apollo on the other, and they've slowly spread across Europe. And by the time they reach Britain, they're essentially just abstractions. You can barely make out what they originally were. But you have those kind of abstracted renderings of the charioteer, but you also have birds, you have horses, you have crescent moons. And from the point where Caesar invades and then leaves, you also have the names of people and also, amazingly, of places. So I'll give 3 examples of coins that give us specific names and what that can tell us about the situation in Britain before Claudius's invasion. So one of them is minted by a people we've already heard of called the Trinovantes.
They're the big cheeses in the last episode.
So they're in Essex,
and
kind of moving towards where London would now be. And you get coins minted there from about 35 BC, so 20 years after Caesar's expedition, by a king called Adedamarus.
Right.
And this is a guy, we only know his name through his coins. Okay. There's no mention of him in any classical sources. He's the king of the Trinovantes. And what we can tell from his coins is that he moves his capital from Hertfordshire, so to the west of his kingdom, to Essex, to a place called Camalodunum, which today is Colchester, right, in Essex.
Yeah.
So that's all we know about him. But we can trace the fact that he's moved his capital and founded this kind of, this new place. Then we have his neighbour, a king of the Cativalorni, who we again heard about in the previous episode. These are the ones who fought under Cassivellaunus against Caesar. And this is a guy called Tasciovanus. And Dominic, I have one of his coins.
Oh, that's very exciting, Tom.
One of my most precious possessions. It dated to about 25 BC, and it shows him and his son in double profile. But the thing that's really amazing about this coin, and the reason I got it, is that next to the faces of these two kings, the king Tascivanus and his son, you have letters, Latin letters, and they spell out Veru, so Veru, and that's an abbreviation for Verulamion, which is today the city of St. Albans, about 20 miles kind of northwest of London. And this is the very earliest record we have of a British place name from Britain. So it's amazing. This is the first time you could hold it in your hand, a complete thrill. And again, we can purely using the coins, because again, Tascivanus is not mentioned in any classical source. We can see how he's throwing his weight around, how he goes to war with the Trinovantes, how for a brief period from about 15 to 10 BC, he's issuing coins from Camalodunum, so presumably he's conquered it, and then he gets thrown out. There's a war. He retreats again. So you can see there's war between these two tribes purely on the basis of the coins. And then the third one is our friend Commius, who we mentioned in the previous episode, Caesar's kind of slippery ally, who's always kind of switching sides, who becomes king of the Atrebates in the south, to the south of the Cativalorni. And he's probably the first king to issue to issue coins with his name on in Britain. And to listeners, they may seem just kind of weird names, these weird tribes, difficult to get a handle on. But just to emphasize, I mean, this is amazing, because this is where British history based on British sources begins. We think of all the British political rivalries that we've talked about. This is the earliest evidence from a British source for that long tradition of political rivalry that we have.
This is the Johnson, Truss and Sunak of their day, Tom.
Yeah. Unbelievably exciting.
What a glorious progression that is.
Indeed. Progress. So what you have essentially in the southeast of Britain is a three-way contest, three rival groupings, three rival kings.
Right.
And over the course of the decades that follow, so through the Augustan period, under Tiberius, under Caligula, you can use these coins to work out for the first time the course of politics in an area of Britain. And the big news, the big story, is the re-emergence to supremacy of the Cativalorni, the guys who occupy the home counties.
Right. Surrey,
Bedfordshire, all that. And as they expand, so the Trinovantes to the east and the Atrebates to the south are slowly eclipsed. And the key figure in this rise to greatness is the son of Tascivanus, is a man called Cunobalin. So he is the Cymbeline of Shakespeare's play.
Oh, right, yeah.
He has this. His name seems to mean strong dog.
It's a good name.
Which is a very good name. And he, as his father had done, but this time permanently, subdues the Trinovantes and makes Camalodunum his kind of permanent headquarters, his permanent capital. And meanwhile, his brother is expanding southwards into the lands of the Atrebates. And Cunobalin is so successful that even Suetonius, the Roman biographer, he refers to him as King of the Britons, simply. He's seen as the domineering figure in Britain. And when he dies in about AD 40, he's succeeded by his two sons, one of whom is called Togodumnus, who seems to have been centered in Verulamion and Camalodunum. So he's got that tranche. And Togodumnus' brother is a man called Caraticus. And Caraticus continues with the conquest of the Atrebates, so moving south. And within a year or so of Cunobalin's death, Caraticus has cornered the king of the Atrebates in a kind of around where Chichester is now. So that's down by kind of Portsmouth Harbour. And there's a kind of peninsula. It's protected by great dikes. And this is the last holdout of the Atrebatic king. And Caraticus forces his way through. The Atrebatic king flees across the channel. And the name of this king, based on his coins, is Verica. And this almost certainly is the Bericus who is mentioned by Dio. So there's a merging of the evidence from British coins and the classical sources.
Right, Bericus, who had been forced into exile by a coup against him and had persuaded Claudius to send an army against the Britons, so says Cassius Dio, and that matches the coin evidence. That's fascinating. So Caraticus is the first character in British history that I remember ever studying, because he ends up being a bit of he's perceived as a sort of freedom fighter in your sort
I think he is a freedom fighter.
There's no way about it, really. The sort of old-fashioned heroic narrative of British history. But before we turn to Caraticus, so Bericus, I know you do because you've written it in the notes. You see Bericus as a sort of he's like Ambassador Graham Martin fleeing
yes.
the US embassy in Saigon in 1975. Explain to me that analogy, Tom?
Right. So Caraticus becomes a freedom fighter, but before that, he's very keen on conquering people.
Yeah.
I mean, the Britons are perfectly capable of engaging imperialism themselves. And when he conquers the last holdout, this tip of land down by where Chichester is now on the south coast, surrounded by dikes. So it's a bit like the wall surrounding the US embassy in Saigon. And the reason I make that comparison is because of an extraordinary discovery that was made about 100 years ago. And this helmet is encrusted with oysters, had clearly been lying in the harbour for centuries and centuries. And it's a make that is pre-Claudian invasion. So it must have been there in the decades at some point before the Roman invasion, which implies a Roman military presence at the court of Bericus or Verica, whatever you want to call him. So you could kind of imagine a Roman military guard perhaps escorting Berica or Vericus, whatever you want to call him, out of his military advisors. And, this would be seen as a kind of humiliation for Rome to lose one of their client kings in this way. And it would absolutely provide a kind of casus belli, I think, a kind of justification for the invasion.
So if that's the case, right, if the Romans had military advisors with this guy Bericus, who's been attacked by Caraticus, does that imply that in the century since Julius Caesar came and went, that the contacts have not just continued, but possibly deepened, so that the Romans have client kings, they have they have their patronage, they are sending military advisors to Britain, and the only reason it's not recorded is we don't really have that many sources, and the particular sources that record that have been lost.
You're right. I mean, we have very few sources. We do have kind of the occasional tangential allusion to the fact that British kings are always being expelled and kind of going to Rome and asking for help. So Augustus, for instance, he has this great thing of the res gestae. It's basically his kind of, his CV, all his achievements. And he describes a British king coming to him and asking for help. And there's also a sense, I think, that these British kings are sending their sons as hostages to Rome. We have an account by Strabo, the geographer, who's writing in the time of Augustus. He says he saw them. He says, I saw in Rome young men from Britain who were taller even than the Gauls and taller than the tallest Roman by half a foot, but they were bandy-legged and most uncouth in appearance. Oh. And you have to wonder whether this is where, the Trinovantes or the Cativalorni are getting their taste for coins from princes who've been raised in Rome and who are going back with a taste for wine, a taste for whatever, and a taste for stamping their names on coins. And
on the point about the contacts, so if they're sending hostages and all that, that also then makes sense of. So Caligula had talked about attacking Britain, hadn't he? He had. He had amassed his army in this very famous episode. Again, anyone who's read I Claudius or the Suetonius will know this very well. He amasses his army. They think they're going to invade Britain, but actually he says, "No, we're going to humiliate Neptune," and they all gather seashells.
That's right.
Did that really happen, or was that just anti-Caligula propaganda?
Come to that in a minute. I mean, the context for that is Cunobelin's conquests in the lands of the Trinovantes and the Atrebates, both of whom are allies of Rome. And so Cunobelin, by doing this, is breaking all kinds of treaties that presumably he had signed with Rome. So Tiberius, for instance, had been sending him lots of gold. So this is a standing provocation, and I don't think there's much doubt that Caligula thinks, well, this is absolutely justification enough for an invasion. And he actually, his reputation is that he's kind of mad, absolute lunatic, but actually he makes very, very sensible preparations. So in Germany, he recruits 2 entire new legions. so that he can take 2 legions from the German frontier to Britain, and there won't be a kind of threat to the Rhine frontier. And he also builds a huge lighthouse at what's now Boulogne that can, spill its light out across the channel. So he's building up naval facilities. He's beefing up his military resources. He seems to be behaving quite well, which makes the whole story about why he then orders his soldiers to pick up shells absolutely baffling, completely baffling.
Right.
I don't really know what the answer is. The best suggestion I can come up with is that perhaps there was a mutiny under Caligula as well, and that Caligula didn't want to acknowledge this because it would be damaging for his prestige. And so this is why he does the whole Neptune shell picking. But it's really difficult to know. But whatever the precise explanation for what's going on there, I think it is clear that Caligula's preparations had provided Claudius, who succeeds Caligula when Caligula's assassinated, with the perfect opportunity to launch this invasion. He has the justification because the Cativaloni have been behaving badly to his allies. He has the opportunity because he has all these additional legions that have been recruited.
Right.
He has all this naval infrastructure, and he has the motivation because he needs to establish himself and burnish his prestige. And so it is in the early summer of AD 43, after his freedman has come and has suppressed the revolt, and they've all had a good laugh about it, that some probably 30 to 40,000 men, so either 3 or 4 legions plus auxiliary troops and supplies and all that kind of thing, set sail from Boulogne, pulling out from the harbour beneath the great glow of the lighthouse built by Caligula. Ships must have numbered, several hundred. They sail out into the channel, and when they get out there, they're blown off course by contrary winds. Everyone starts, feeling seasick, terrified, thinking the worst, dreading sea monsters. But then high up in the sky, they see a shooting star, and it's rising in the east, and it's falling in the west over the island of Britain. And Dio, who reports this, says of this remarkable occurrence that the soldiers took it as an omen of success.
And was it?
It was.
Oh, great.
So they're not shipwrecked. They make an unopposed landing. It's not absolutely clear exactly how they make their landing. So Dio says that they make it in 3 waves. So that might be they're landing in one place in succession, or it might be that they're kind of making 3 beachheads. One of them certainly is... It's by the Isle of Thanet. That's the rule.
But of course,
you've got to go there.
Yeah.
And it's on an island that is it's between the Isle of Thanet and the mainland in this kind of the channel called the Wantsum Channel on this island, which is easily connectable to the mainland, which becomes the great naval base of Rutupiae, or Richborough as it's called now. And Romans do their usual stuff. They build, ditches, establish it as a supply base. But it's possible that they also send contingents to the region in Chichester, which had been the stronghold of the Atrebates. Because if you remember, the shooting star described by Dio is coming from the east to the west, and Dio says that they were sailing in the direction, the soldiers, when they saw that. So perhaps, that's one of the landing places, and the other landing place, I don't know, maybe in Sussex, something like that. We don't know. But what is clear is that bridgeheads are established, and a 2-pronged invasion is launched against the Cativaloni, so heading up towards the Thames. Some are going up from the south coast, from the lands of the Atrebates. Others are moving from the Isle of Thanet across Kent. There's a great battle, probably at the Medway. One of the guys Roman officers who performs very well there is a man called Vespasian, who is in charge of the Second Legion.
A name to conjure with. Yeah,
and he also has these very impressive German mercenaries called the Batavians, these auxiliaries who are serving the Romans, and they have the very estimable ability to cross rivers in full armour, and so they swim across the Medway probably and catch the Britons in the rear, and so it's a very bloody contest, but the Romans manage to force their way across the river, and then they rendezvous with the other prong of the attack on the banks of the Thames. They cross the Thames, probably in the vicinity of London, probably building the bridge that will become London Bridge, forcing their way across, and they defeat the combined forces of the 2 sons of Cunobalin, Caraticus and Togodumnus. And the question then is, what happens to those 2 men? Caraticus flees westwards and inland, and you talked about him as he will become the great resistance fighter.
Yeah.
That's where he's going. He is going to try and raise tribes in the interior of Britain against the threat of the Roman advance, to kind of open their eyes to what is coming. Togdamnus is more intriguing. So Dio says that he dies in the battle, but it's been argued that Dio is mistranslating a word in Latin, and that perhaps Togdamnus survived. And the reason for that is that Tacitus, who is the other great historian of this period, who gives us a kind of balancing narrative, he describes a king called Togidubnus, who rules the lands of the Atrebates as a loyal ally of Rome for decades. He's also called Cogidubnus in his
But the
his
names are so similar, aren't they?
They're so similar. And so it's become quite a popular theory. I mean, not universally accepted, but lots of scholars give it credence, that perhaps this is what happened to him, that rather than dying, he was turned.
Right.
That he became a collaborator with the Romans. And if that's the case, then the fate of the two brothers, Caraticus and Togidumnus, illustrates essentially the two alternatives that are open to the British elites, either to continue resistance or to collaborate.
Yeah.
And what's clear is that for the Cativalorni, the vast mass of the Cativalorni, they don't really have an option. Their resistance has been broken. Aulus Plautius, who's on the far side of the Thames now, halts because he knows that he has fulfilled his mission, which is to prepare the way for Claudius to come to Britain and lay claim to a great victory. So the word reaches Rome.
Yeah.
Claudius leaves Rome. He sails up to Marseille from Ostia, the port of Rome, crosses Gaul, arrives in Richborough, Retupii, comes up and joins Aulus Plautius, and they then advance on Camalodunum, which effectively has been cast by the Romans as the capital, not just of the Cativalorni, but of Britain. And actually, Camalodunum is a dump. It's so Shepherd Freer, in his great history of Britain, which he wrote several decades ago, but I don't think there's any particular reason to change his judgment on it. The habitations he wrote were for the most part small huts of prehistoric character, so nothing that a Roman emperor would find very impressive. But Claudius doesn't care, because he's got his victory, and so he makes a splendid triumphal entry. He's brought the Praetorians. He's probably, although again inevitably there are scholars who dispute this, but I think probably he has elephants.
Wow.
So, this is all very impressive.
They've obviously shipped them across the channel.
The evidence, I think, suggests that. It's capable of being read kind of different ways,
Okay.
but I think probably, yes, he's brought elephants with him, and he duly receives the submission of 11 British kings, including, if a subsequent record is correct, a king from Orkney, so miles in the north, the islands north of Scotland. So impressive.
So before we just get on to Claudius and the time he spends in Britain, two questions. Number one, you talk about breaking the British resistance. Presumably the Romans, I mean, as we've said, an incredibly professional army, technologically the most advanced army in the kind of Eurasian world. And the Britons, they've got their moustaches, they've got their javelins.
They've got their slings.
They've got their slings and their chariots. But presumably just a pitiful force.
No, they're not pitiful. They're not pitiful. The charge of a British army is terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
If you can withstand it, then you will probably win. And Roman professional training is all about conditioning soldiers to withstand a charge like that. And of course, giving them the kind of armor and kit that will enable them to do it.
So here's the thing. Do the Britons have swords?
They have swords, yes.
Okay.
Very impressive swords.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
Which they seem to have offered as offerings to the gods, to the various rivers where they've been dredged, which is why you can now go and see them in museums.
And my second question, Aulus Plautius is a general, obviously. He's commanded the army. Claudius has not commanded it. Is that not an issue for Claudius with the whole prestige thing and being an imperator? It doesn't matter.
No, it's like Caesar. It's all about the story. Okay. It's all about the spin that he can give it. And when he goes back to Rome, he really does spin it. So there are celebrations across the empire. In Rome, he celebrates a triumph. So, this great parade through the streets of Rome. He gets given the name of Britannicus. There's a huge triumphal arch. He restages the conquest of Camalodunum, as the Romans call Camalodunum, in a gladiatorial display. They've brought Britons who ride chariots and everything. It's like kind of Buffalo Bill. Only people actually get killed as part of the display. So, I mean, he's all over it. And you get a sense of how this then gets promoted across the empire from a city called Aphrodisias in what's now Turkey, where there's a very celebrated frieze of Claudius as he's got an absolute six-pack. There's no hint that he might have trouble walking. He's an absolute brute, and he's holding the first representation of Britannia as a female. He's forced her down to her knees. Her tunic has been pulled off her breasts, and it's pretty clear what Claudius is about to do to her. And, you know, the Romans don't really have any compunction in celebrating the fact that what they're doing to Britain is raping it.
Yeah.
There is an element of seduction. So, you know, if Togedubnus has become the king of this kind of client kingdom in the south, then he's very, very richly rewarded. There's a great villa there called Fishbourne, which lots of scholars again think was given to Togedubnus as a kind of reward. It's the equivalent of Indian princes buying Rolls Royces for their palaces, sending their sons to Harrow, that kind of thing. He's being given the best that the Roman Empire can give in terms of material culture and prestige.
So he's got his baths and a hypercaust and marble statues and stuff.
Yes, and in a town like Verulamium, so it comes to be called Verulamium by the Romans, within the first years, there are bath complexes being built. There are temples, there are forums. And the baths are the most important because this is a kind of socializing mechanism. So the British elites can go there, you know, they start to wear togas, be acclimatized to the new dispensation. So as I say, if you collaborate, there are rewards on offer. But if you resist, then Roman response is incredibly brutal. So Camulodunum becomes the headquarters of the 20th Legion. The soldiers treat the natives basically as slaves, appropriating their harvests, their livestock, probably their women. In 49, the 20th Legion abandons this base, and Camulodunum is transformed into what the Romans called a colonia, which is essentially a transplantation of Rome to a kind of distant territory. And it's essentially a showcase for Roman culture. So they build an enormous temple to Claudius. I mean, vast in the way that Durham Cathedral would have appeared vast to the people of the north in the wake of the Norman conquest. And the colonists, the people who settle there, are retired Roman soldiers. And so Tacitus explains the value of this. He says, you know, this constituted a strong body of veterans, a defense against rebels, and a means of instilling in our allies respect for our laws. And there are no fortifications built around this colonia, Camulodunum, and it reflects the fact that the Romans by this point assume that the southeast is now secured. Meanwhile, legions are fanning out to conquer the rest of Britain. So we can track the advance of one of those generals, Vespasian, who we've mentioned, in command of the Second Legion. He heads into the southwest, and Suetonius, who writes a biography of him, says that he brought 2 very strong tribes under Roman rule, together with over 20 large settlements, and Vectis, that's the Isle of Wight, an island just off Britain. Now, Dominic, I don't know if you remember, I always did as a child, that I was always told that this included Maiden Castle, which is this enormous hill fort outside
very famous
Dorchester, the county town of Dorset. And this was excavated in the late 1930s by 2 archaeologists, Mortimer Wheeler and his wife. And his wife died. Mortimer Wheeler then wrote up the report in 1941. And in it, he says how he has identified the Roman conquest, the Roman storming of Maiden Castle, how there'd been this massive artillery barrage. And he says how he's found a ballista bolt embedded in the spine of one of the Britons who were buried there at the gateway of the hill fort. And this was still being repeated in the books that I was reading as a kind of Rome enthusiastic child in the 70s. But sadly, not true. He'd been massively overinterpreting it. There was no military bolt in the spine. And it turns out that Maiden Castle had actually been abandoned decades before the Roman invasion. And if you think about it, anyone who's been to Maiden Castle, it is huge. It's a vast structure. It would have been indefensible. I mean, there simply wouldn't have been enough people to defend it. So it's probably a kind of a centre for cultic practices, for the sacral. So Ronald Hutton says that hill forts, you know, if people want to know what did the sacral look like in the British landscape. Look at hill forts.
Okay.
That's probably what they were. But I think that Mortimer Wheeler, when he's writing it in 41, he obviously has the experience of the great 20th century wars in his mind. He'd fought in the First World War.
Yeah.
He'd go on to fight in the Second World War. He becomes very decorated. And I think that he saw in the Roman conquest a preview of the horrors of 20th century warfare, where you would have artillery barrages and then soldiers going in. And the details may be wrong, but that sense of mass slaughter, mass enslavement, mass rape, I mean, he's not wrong. He's not wrong.
How do we know that?
That is what's going on.
How do we know that these things happened?
We can look at, I suppose, the paradigmatic example of this is what happens in Wales. And you asked earlier, why are the Romans going to Britain? Chief, it's for the mineral wealth.
Yeah.
And gold, silver, lead is to be found above all in Wales. And the conquest of Wales, as it was for, say, the English in the Middle Ages, is a very protracted and bloody process.
Because of the geography.
So by
the hills.
Because of geography.
The valleys, the forests, all that stuff.
So by 47, Aulus Plautius is recalled to Rome. He doesn't have a triumph because only emperors can have triumphs by this point, but he's given what's called an ovation. So it's basically a triumph, and you don't ride in a chariot, you walk.
Right.
He leaves an island, the lowlands of which have been occupied. So in a line from the Humber down to the Exe in Devon. But of course, beyond the frontier is Wales. And Duncan Mackay, in his wonderful book on Boudecia, he describes it. When the Romans had first landed in southern Britain, those distant tribes and their brooding cloud-hung hills were no more than a darkness beyond the horizon. But when the Romans go into Wales, of course, they're plunging into the darkness as they would see it. And they're confronting two tribal groupings, the Silures in the south, so the Silurians, Dominic, as in Doctor Who. Yeah. And the Ordovicians in the north. So anyone interested in the in prehistory will recognize, and geology will recognize them as kind of periods of the geological past derived from the rocks that you get in the territories of these tribes. And the resistance there is incredibly brutal. And this is partly because Caratacus has made his base there.
So that's super interesting. If Caratacus has made his base there, does that imply a kind of shared identity? Because he is a king from a long way away. I mean, days march or walk.
Yeah, I agree. It's fascinating. And I think that he makes common cause with the tribes in Wales. I mean, Wales is an anachronistic word, but let's call it Wales, the Welsh tribes, because he brings an understanding of how the Romans operate that the Welsh tribes wouldn't have, because they don't really know what's about to hit them.
Right.
And so it's a kind of, it's an alliance of convenience, and it's very successful. And Caratacus and the Welsh tribes continue their fight until in 51, he's cornered by a Roman army and he's defeated in pitched battle. He flees to the upland regions of what's now kind of the Midlands and Yorkshire, where there's a queen called Cartimandua. And Cartimandua is an ally of the Roman people, and so she hands Caratacus over to the Romans. And this is always cast as an act of the basest treachery.
Yes, terrible.
But I think it's probably slightly more complicated than that, and it's probably a bit like she's playing the role that Commius did with Caesar. So she's essentially the kind of, not the middleman, the middle woman, who's negotiating terms between the two sides. And so Caratacus is captured. He's taken off to Rome. He's led through the streets in chains. Everyone's terribly impressed by him, his noble bearing, the splendor of his golden moustache, all of that. And Claudius, with an imperious show of magnanimity, orders his chains to be struck off. And Caratacus then wanders around Rome saying, in an inspiring manner, I have no idea why the Romans came to conquer my lands when you have such wealth. Why do you need my mean and backward land
Do you know what?
when you have such a splendid capital?
I remember that story so well from when I was about 7. And I love that because everyone comes out well from that story. Don't they?
Claudius does. Graticus does. I suppose Cartimandua doesn't.
No, I guess not.
And she'll be getting up to more mischief in due course, as we will see. But the thing is that in Wales, the Caratacus is captured doesn't stop the fighting. They carry on, and this may reflect the influence of the Druids, who have their base up in Anglesey.
So that's
Mona.
really true. So that's another thing that I learned when I was 7 that stuck in my mind. Anglesey was full of these wild-haired wizards. And this is true.
It is true. It is true. And what is also true is that there are rumours that spread unsurprisingly through the Welsh tribes that the Romans are intending genocide. So the Silurians in particular are outraged by a report that Plautus's replacement as governor, a man called Ostorius Scapula, had declared that the name of the Silurians should be wiped from the face of the earth. And so the campaign is of a genocidal scope. The Romans are trying to wipe the Silurians out. The Silurians are trying to wipe the Romans out. And in fact, during Scapula's term of office, a legion is so badly mauled that it has to retreat. And that's obviously a kind of, devastating blow to Roman prestige. And Scapula actually dies in office, it seems, of the strain. And he's followed by 2 more governors, and they can't pacify the Welsh. The bloodshed continues, the slaughter, the enslavement. And so finally, in 58, by which point Claudius has been dead for 4 years and been succeeded by his young heir Nero, the decision is taken to send Rome's best general to sort the mess out. And this is a man called Gaius Suetonius Paulinus. And he has experience of fighting in mountains because he had been the governor of Mauritania, so Morocco as it is now. And he'd been the first person to lead a Roman military expedition up into the Atlas Mountains, where he'd seen all kinds of wonders. And so he seems absolutely the man for a mountain campaign in the wilds of Britain. And he basically breaks the Silurians and the Ordovicians. So after 2 years campaigning, so we're now into AD 60, the Silurians have been crushed so totally that they're not mentioned for at least a couple of decades after Paulinus's term of office. And he also does an Edward I and establishes a great complex of forts in the northern region of Wales where the Ordovicians have their strongholds. And by building this kind of great network of forts, he is able to target the last stronghold, the last outpost, the great centre of Druidical practice, the island of Anglesey. And in the summer of AD 60, he marches a force of about 15,000 men. So that's legionaries, his own legion, another legion, auxiliaries. And they stand on the shores of the Menai Strait looking across at Anglesey. And there, Dominic, is the bit that you probably remember from your Ladybird book.
I'm just going to read it. It's from Tacitus, isn't it? There stood along the shore a diverse line, dense with arms and men, and with females running in between. In funereal clothing and with tumbling hair, they were flourishing firebrands after the manner of the Furies, and Druids around about, pouring forth ominous prayers with their hands raised to the sky. So actually, Tom, this is reminiscent of the scene when Caesar had landed more than a century earlier. This image of kind of barbarism, mystical barbarism on the other side of the strait.
Except that when Caesar lands, it's warriors that he's confronting.
This is wizards.
Here it's women and
wizards.
Druids, women and wizards, which in a way makes it more kind of
it's
terrifying.
Definitely, it's absolutely. I'm terrified just thinking about it.
And so it's so vivid, and so the temptation is to say, oh, this is just made up. How could Tacitus possibly know? But I think it has the immediacy of a kind of authentic experience. And we know how Tacitus could have heard about this because Tacitus is the son-in-law of a man called Agricola, who will go on to play a great role in the history of the Roman conquest, but who at the time was a tribune on the staff of Suetonius Paulinus and almost certainly would have described it to Tacitus. And so I see no particular reason to doubt the general drift of that description, nor the account of what happens, because Paulinus has prepared kind of shallow-bottomed landing craft. His forces managed to get across the Menai Straits. The Britons on Anglesey then are absolute toast. There's the usual, the mass slaughter, mass enslavement. And it's from Tacitus that we get evidence, and people can believe it to the degree that they want to, of human sacrifice. So talking about the Druids, Tacitus writes, their groves devoted to inhuman superstitions were destroyed. They deemed it indeed a duty to cover their altars with the blood of captives and to consult their deities through human entrails.
Right.
So you may say this is imperialist propaganda, or you may look at the evidence of the Carthaginians or the Aztecs and say, well, it's, why not? We shouldn't impose our categories of what is right and wrong on a distant and ancient people.
Yeah.
On balance, I would say probably.
Yeah.
But we can't be certain.
I mean, to be fair, I've been to North Wales. So
I knew you were going to say that.
Sorry, it's just an open goal.
Yeah, there we lose all our Welsh listeners.
Yeah. And I say that as a man who's Tom,
who is, of course, a quarter Welsh himself.
Exactly. So,
yes.
I mean,
Yes. So it's what's absolutely certain, even if there aren't graves full of human entrails, this is a great victory. Because it seems at last as though all of southern Britain, so below the line of the Mersey and the Humber, essentially has been brought to acknowledge Roman supremacy. And Suetonius Paulinus, sweaty, bloodstained, wiping his brow, can nevertheless breathe a huge sigh of relief, feel incredibly proud of what he's accomplished. But then, Dominic,
oh my word,
in the very hour
What's
of
coming?
his triumph, crossing the straits, travel-stained, exhausted, a messenger from the far southeastern corner of Britain, bringing terrible news that on the far side of Britain, a people called the Iceni, who we haven't yet mentioned, have risen in revolt, that they are marching on Camalodunum, the great Colonia, the capital of Britain, the showcase of Roman power. And worst of all, Dominic, the Iceni are led by a woman.
A woman? Well, on that bombshell, Tom, thank you very much for that tour de force. That is the cliffhanger to end all cliffhangers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.